Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Nearly 1/3 of those in the new European Parliament are dedicated to destroying the European Union. That seems to be the main takeaway from the EU elections last weekend. Prior to those elections in the UK, we talked to you last week about how many Britons are dissatisfied with their relationship with the EU. Across Europe, the trend is much the same. Voters are fed up with the mainstream parties in their respective nations, and they want change. Many of them want a more open relationship with the European Union, one that allows for more flexibility and freedom. This widespread rejection of mainstream political parties in Europe could lead to a two-tiered Europe, one with a group of nations on the outside that are loosely affiliated with those on the inside, a tightly integrated inner core of nations that transforms into the biblically prophesied European superstate.
This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world.
And he said unto me, you must prophesy again.
Last week on the Trumpet Daily, we talked to you about the significance of the UK elections there and the rise of the Independence Party. And as I said there at the top of the program, that trend really is there all across Europe. I want to start today with a quote from the New York Times. This is from Monday, talking about the weekend elections all across Europe. It says, an angry eruption of populist insurgency in the elections for the European Parliament rippled across the continent on Monday, unnerving the political establishment and calling into question the very institutions and assumptions at the heart of Europe's post-World War II order. I mean, this really comes at a difficult time for Europe. We talked to you over the last few months, really, about the threat from the East coming from Vladimir Putin. Of course, Europe's never really recovered from the economic collapse of 2008. And now you have all of these popular elections with these independence parties and other extremist movements that are on the rise, and the more mainstream parties that are scrambling, trying to figure out how it can hold on to power and maintain unity there in the Union. Continuing from the Times, it says, but the insurgent success has nonetheless upended a once immutable belief laid out in the 1957 Treaty of Rome that Europe is moving fitfully but inevitably toward an ever closer union. It says it's also threatened to redraw, notice this, the domestic political landscape in several core members of the 28-nation bloc, putting pressure on mainstream parties, particularly in Britain and France, to reshape their policies to recover lost ground. Notice those words there, redraw and reshape. We've talked to you recently even about how it's going to be reconfigured in so many ways, but not just the policies, the political policies or the policies of the parties themselves, but we've also been telling you that even Europe's borders are going to be reconfigured before this is all said and done. Now, when that happens, we've been saying it all along, you can say that you heard it at thetrumpet.com first, or from some of our publications, our magazines. Perhaps let's notice Revelation chapter 17. I'll take you just through a few verses that if you've studied our material, you've read these verses before, but it's important to review them now in light of what's happening. As far back as 1963, Herbert W. Armstrong and his staff there at the Plain Truth, and of course all the many booklets and books that he produced over the course of his 50-year ministry, as far back as 1963, we're talking about a half century ago, he was talking about the emergence of this European superpower, back when it was just a little six-nation European coal and steel community, it was called. And he said that from that six-nation grouping, it's going to expand and grow into a 10-nation consortium. Now today you look at the EU and it's, I guess, 28 nations or so that are affiliated with it. Fewer than that if you count the euro. In any event, it's had its swings, but the Bible tells us it's going to downsize to that group of 10 10 kings, or 10 groups of nations. This is a quote from 1963. Mr. Armstrong said, "Remember that there must be 10 nations or groups of nations to comprise the final resurrection of the modern Holy Roman Empire." Now that grouping of 10 is clearly identified here in Revelation 17 and clearly identified over in Daniel 2, which we'll look at here in just a minute as well. Now, Mr. Armstrong also noted that when that grouping is finalized, Germany is going to be the dominant power nationally. Germany is going to dominate that union. Let me just give you another quote in response to the elections from last weekend. This is from The Local, which is Europe's news in English. It gathers quotes from sources all across Europe. This happens to be from a German paper. And it says, "A dangerous divide is opening up in Europe." This is quoting the Tagesspiegel. "Pro-European Germany is getting more and more powerful and is distancing itself further and further from the rest of the Union." So you have these nations like, Britain, obviously, Denmark, even France was thrown into turmoil after its elections. And these movements that want to pull away from Europe. Germany, meanwhile, is very much pro-European. There's a few smaller movements there that want to go back to the Deutschmark and such, but for the most part, they're very much pro-European Union. And one of the results from this past weekend is that, as it says there, Germany is gaining more and more power. Now, even before last weekend's elections, Germany was already the dominant power in Europe. And the results from those elections, I mean, that's only going to increase its power. This German newspaper that's quoted in The Local, it goes on and talks about how for the French president and for the British prime minister, last weekend's elections really were, they were humiliating for the leaders of the mainstream parties, the parties that have traditionally enjoyed the most support. They were humiliated from the results. And it went on to say how that the old European powers are being left out in the cold, and, quote, "Germany's influence on EU politics grows bigger and bigger, which in turn reinforces the resistance in Europe to a union which is already seen as too German." So as Germany increases in power, there's others on the outside that are saying, wait a minute, we don't want this, we want to get out. So where do you suppose this is leading? It's leading exactly to what the Bible describes. In Revelation 17 and verse 12, it says here, "And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast." This is referring to the latter-day formation of the United States of Europe. These 10 horns are part of the 7th head. I can't get into all the explanation here regarding the 7 heads and the other prophecies in Revelation 13, Daniel 7, and so on. You can look in our book, Who or What is the Prophetic Beast, if you'd like to study that further. But suffice it to say, these 10 horns represent 10 heads of state in Europe, 10 of them, that are going to come together as one group, one core group, that will together make up this prophesied European superstate. Verse 13, it says, "And these have one mind, and shall give their power and strength," it says, "unto the beast." One mind, you see, the opposite really of democracy, where you have all these many different minds. But there's going to be one guiding hand, whether you look at it in the spiritual sense or the physical. One dominant nation, one dominant church, one dominant spirit. Daniel chapter 2, let's just look at this and see what the prophet Daniel had to say about these 10 kings. These 10 kings. Now, Mr. Armstrong, as you know, if you followed us for any amount of time, you know that he prophesied for decades. Going back, even, I gave you the quote from 1963, but going back even before that, to the 50s and the 40s even. He talked about this strong European power, even when Europe, Germany in particular, was in ruin and rubble after World War II. He said Germany would rise again. He talked about the union of 10 kings. He said it would come from the west and the eastern part of Europe. He said this at a time when communism drew a line right across the middle of Europe. He said this at a time when Berlin itself was divided and not even the capital of Germany. And yet he talked about this union being resurrected in the spirit of Charlemagne and some of the others that we'll mention just in a little bit. And now look at what's happening. He knew this back in the 40s and 50s because he studied prophecies like Daniel 2 and Revelation 17. And so when everyone's eyes, was looking elsewhere, Mr. Armstrong was focusing on Europe, as we should be today. I mean, even today, people really aren't paying attention to Europe, not like they should be. Some of that's understandable with the movements of Vladimir Putin, and as I talked about yesterday now, the alliance between Russia and China, and India now swinging over into the camp of the kings of the East. But these are pretty dramatic events that are happening. Just over this past week, or the last weekend, when many of us in America were enjoying a 3-day weekend, there were some earth-shaking events happening in this world, in Europe and elsewhere. As I talked to you about yesterday, this is Daniel 2, verse 28. It says, "But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets." This is the prophet Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, "and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed are these." So Nebuchadnezzar had this vision or this dream of this giant statue, which represented all of these powerful Gentile empires or kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar representing the first of these 4 Gentile kingdoms. And Daniel told him that later in the passage here in Daniel 2. He represented the image's head of gold. And then after that, there were the chest, the arms of silver representing the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the belly of bronze representing Alexander the Great and the Greco-Macedonian Empire. And then after that, you had the legs of iron representing the mighty Roman Empire. 2 legs, by the way, which symbolized the 2 capitals of that powerful empire in Rome and Constantinople, which was the case for many centuries. Now, that Roman Empire did collapse in 476 AD, but it was revived by Justinian in 554. It was resurrected. And some of those other prophecies that I don't have time to get to, they talk specifically about the 7 resurrections of the Holy Roman Empire, this church-state combine. And then more specifically, they talk about the 10 kings that are going to be part of that final and that 7th and final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. That's what we're witnessing. And before this, you could go back and track those 7 resurrections in history. Justinian, as I mentioned, others like Charlemagne, like Napoleon, Hitler. You can see just from history, much of this history, by the way, is talked about in this booklet. We'll talk to you about this at the end. Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. This will give you the historical context of what we're seeing today, together with the prophecies, some of which we're covering right here. And it'll bring you right up to speed with where you need to be to understand what's happening, to understand the significance of what Vladimir Putin is doing to bring about this Daniel 8 man in the heart of Europe, the significance of the economic crisis that still hasn't been resolved. It hasn't been fixed. A few Band-Aids have been put on it supposedly, but it still isn't, it's going to get worse. That's the point. And then now you have these elections. Now you have these stronger movements. You have a lot of the same things happening, really, that happened back during the World War I and World War II era. History, to some extent, is repeating itself. There's going to be a few differences this final time. But you can sure learn a lot from history, and all the more so from prophecy. Verse 41, a little further down in Daniel 2. says, and whereas you saw the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, and the kingdom, it says, shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, it's talking about the Roman Empire, for as much as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And verse 42 says, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Now these 10 toes symbolize these 10 contemporaneous kings. This is not successive. This is 10 kings, just like Revelation 17:12 talks about. 10 kings that join together during this final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. Now it's going to be a short-lived reign. We've always said this. Mr. Armstrong has always said this. And it's short-lived because of this inconsistent mixture. Well, also because of God's intervention on end-time events. But it's an inconsistent mixture. While it lasts, however, it's going to have all the iron force that the Roman Empire has traditionally had. Real strength. Coming right in the spirit of Charlemagne, who waded through rivers of blood in Europe as he carried out his conquest. It's not going to be long before, whatever other factors might fall into line here, it's not going to be long before this oversized union of disparate parts is radically downsized and reconfigured, reshaped, the borders redrawn. And then you have that core European superstate in fulfillment of so many prophecies. And those 10 kings, they're going to give their power to Germany and the church that's guiding the union. This is a quote from Mr. Armstrong. We're going to go back further even to 1956. He's talking about this 10-nation union. He says that, notice how he describes it. This is in 1956, keep in mind. It will possess greater military might by far than the Rome of old, but it will also inherit fatal weaknesses. Prophecy symbolizes this admixture of never equaled military might and unprecedented weakness with the apt phrase, iron mixed with miry clay. It says the European nations will unite militarily, but they are suspicious and envious of each other. They hate one another. Notice that. Mr. Armstrong talks about, he's describing perfectly what you're seeing today. All of these powerful nations, Germany's economy, and the other nations in Europe that have weapons, that have nukes. And yet they're very suspicious of one another. There's nations that are rising up right now and saying, well, hang on a second. I don't know if we can trust Germany. I don't know if we want to be a part of this. That's happening. It's happening right now. Mr. Armstrong wasn't ignorant of these fundamental differences in the nations that comprise this superstate, and neither have we been at the trumpet.com. This church has carried right along. For decades, we've been anticipating what we're seeing right now. This church, Mr. Armstrong before us, we've never said that this European superpower would coalesce together for a long-term run of many decades. It's going to be short-term. That's what the Bible says. They come together for 1 hour, so to speak. But when they do, they're not going to be showing weakness. There's going to be strength there as they go on their final rampage. This is another quote, jumping forward to 1979, even that. That's 35 years ago. He says, the last final brief, notice that, brief resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire by 10 European groups or nations, he said, is now forming. It's now forming. Later on, he says, they shall last but a very short space, possibly no more than 2 to 3.5 years. It's really inspiring when you think about it. That prophecy in Daniel is 2,500 years old, and it talks about present-day Europe, and it describes it perfectly, as if you're reading it from the newspapers from this past weekend. a perfect description. How awesome is the God of this universe who could tell us this far in advance about not just the integration of these nations into a European superpower, possessing all of the strength, the iron-like strength of the traditional Roman Empire, but also telling us that it would be inherently fractious and unstable. God told us that too. It's remarkable. So we've got to keep this prophecy in mind as we see all these other events swirling about. The rise of the Prince of Rosh in Russia, the gathering together of the kings of the East all across Asia, the worsening economic conditions in Europe, the nations that don't want to be part of that core, the uprising of these independence parties, and of course the rise of that Daniel 8 man that's going to bring that core group together for that final 2 to 3.5 year run. All of it's talked about in the Bible. Well, I don't have the He Was Right booklet here with me. I talked to you about this a little bit yesterday. But many of these prophecies going back to 79 and 63 and 1956 and before, I mean, they're talked about and quoted in this wonderful book, He Was Right. Call the number on your screen and order your copy today, or go to thetrumpet.com and you can get your free copy online. This is the booklet I want to draw your attention to, though. Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. All this history, together with some of these prophecies that we've talked about here today, they're discussed at length in this beautiful booklet, this powerful booklet, and we want for you to have it free of charge, no cost, no obligation to you. You can, again, go to either the Trumpet or pick up the phone now and call and get your free copy today at no cost or obligation to you. This is the latest Trumpet magazine. I showed you this yesterday. If you order any of our literature, we'll sign you up for a free 1-year subscription to the Trumpet as well. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time on the Trumpet Daily.